Hey everyone! Welcome back to Hacker News Daily, where we break down the top stories that got the tech community talking. I'm your host, and wow, yesterday was absolutely wild on Hacker News. We went through 30 different stories, and I've pulled out the 5 that really had everyone fired up. We've got everything from massive changes to immigration policy that could reshape Silicon Valley, to open source governance crises, to, and I'm not making this up, ants that can somehow lay eggs that hatch into a completely different species. Yeah, it's one of those days where tech, politics, science, and just pure chaos all collide. So buckle up, because we're diving into the stories that dominated the front page yesterday, starting with something that has the entire tech industry on edge. All right, now we're diving into something that's got the tech community absolutely fired up on Trump's H-1B visa changes. This story exploded on Hacker News with over 850 points and more than 1,100 comments. And honestly, I can see why people are losing their minds over this. So here's what we know. The White House is apparently moving forward with an executive order that would slap a $100,000 fee on each H-1B visa application. And before you ask, yes, that's per visa, not per company. We're talking about a program that's been the backbone of tech talent acquisition for decades, and this could fundamentally change everything about how Silicon Valley operates. The Hacker News discussion on this is fascinating because it's really split the community right down the middle. On one side, you've got folks saying, finally. They argue this could actually fix the H-1B system by pricing out the companies that have been gaming it. See, there's this whole ecosystem of staffing firms, particularly some of the big Indian consulting companies, that have been accused of flooding the system with applications for lower-wage positions. They'll bring someone over on an H-1B, pay them maybe $60,000, $70,000 a year for work that should pay twice that, and essentially use the visa system as a way to undercut American workers. One commenter made a really interesting point. They said if a company truly needs a specialized worker badly enough, $100K is nothing. Google, Apple, Microsoft, they spend more than that on recruiting and relocation for senior engineers already. But for a body shop trying to place hundreds of contractors at below market rates, that math doesn't work anymore. But here's where it gets complicated, and this is what's really got people worried. The executive order apparently includes this discretionary exemption clause where the administration can waive the fee for certain companies or situations. And man, the cynicism in the comments about this was palpable. People are calling it a pay-to-play system, where suddenly tech companies need to curry favor with whoever's in power to get their exemptions approved. One commenter literally called it legalized corruption. Harsh words, but you can see where they're coming from. The brain drain argument is huge here too. Multiple commenters pointed out that the US has basically built its tech dominance on being a magnet for global talent. We're talking about people who founded companies like Google, Tesla, Stripe, immigrants or children of immigrants who came here through programs like H-1B. There's this real fear that if we make it too hard or too expensive to bring talent in, these people will just go to Canada, the UK, or stay in their home countries and compete against us from there. Actually, one of the most interesting takes I saw was from someone who said this is already happening. They mentioned that their company just opened a massive office in Toronto, specifically because it's easier to hire international talent there. Vancouver's becoming a tech hub for the same reason. Mexico City, too. So we might end up in this weird situation where American companies are still hiring the same people, just not in America. There was also this fascinating alternative proposal that kept coming up in the comments. Instead of a flat fee, why not make it a percentage of the worker's compensation? Like, you want to hire someone on H-1B? Fine, but you pay an extra 50% of their salary as a tax. Remove all the caps, let anyone apply, but make it expensive enough that companies only do it when they really need to. The beauty of this system, according to its proponents, is that it self-regulates. You're not going to pay 150% of a salary for someone unless they're genuinely exceptional or filling a critical need.
The human side of this is pretty rough too. There are people in the comments who've been on H-1B for years, waiting for their green cards, and now they're terrified about what happens to them. Do they have to pay the fee to renew? Can their employer decide it's not worth it anymore and just let them go? The uncertainty is brutal, and you can feel the anxiety in some of these comments.
What really struck me reading through all this discussion is how it reveals these fundamental tensions in tech. We want high wages for American workers, but we also want the best talent, regardless of where it comes from. We want to stop abuse of the visa system, but we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want fairness, but we're skeptical of giving any administration too much discretionary power. And look, whether you think this is a long overdue reform or a disaster for American tech probably depends on where you sit. If you're a developer who's watched your wages stagnate while companies bring in cheaper H-1B workers, this might feel like justice. If you're a startup founder who needs specialized talent or someone currently on an H-1B, this probably feels like the walls closing in. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but man, the passion in these comments shows just how much this matters to people in tech. Speaking of battles over control and ownership in tech, that brings us to another massive controversy that erupted yesterday. And this one's about who really owns the tools and technologies we use every day. All right, moving on to our next story, and this one's a doozy. Help us raise $200K to free JavaScript from Oracle. You know, every once in a while, a story comes along that perfectly captures the absurdity of tech intellectual property battles. And folks, this is definitely one of those moments. So here's what's happening. Deno, the JavaScript runtime company, has basically said enough is enough, and filed a formal petition with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office to cancel Oracle's trademark on the word JavaScript. And get this, they're crowdfunding the legal battle, asking the developer community to chip in $200,000 to fund the discovery phase. The response? Over 27,000 developers have already signed their open letter supporting this effort. Now, let me paint you the full picture here, because it's really something. Oracle claims to own the trademark to JavaScript, a programming language they had absolutely nothing to do with creating. Zero. Zilch. Nada. They got it through their acquisition of Sun Microsystems back in 2010, but even Sun didn't create JavaScript. That was Netscape back in the 90s. And here's the kicker. Oracle officially denies that JavaScript is a generic term. They're basically saying, with a straight face, that when millions of developers worldwide say JavaScript, they're referring to Oracle's specific trademark, not just, the programming language that runs literally half the internet. The discovery phase alone, just to gather evidence, needs $200,000. We're talking professional public surveys, expert witnesses from academia, depositions from standards bodies, browser vendors, the whole 9 yards. And Deno's stepping up, saying they have legal standing as a JavaScript runtime to file this petition on behalf of everyone: developers, conferences, book authors, companies, the whole ecosystem. But here's where the community reaction gets really interesting and contentious. The Hacker News discussion on this, it's split right down the middle, and not in the way you might expect. Sure, there's plenty of support for the David versus Goliath narrative here, but there's also this fascinating skepticism bubbling up. A lot of folks are pointing out that Deno isn't exactly a scrappy startup anymore. They raised $21 million in VC funding, so why are they asking regular developers to foot the bill? One commenter put it pretty bluntly. If this is really for the public good, why aren't the big tech companies who actually profit from JavaScript stepping up? Where is Google, Microsoft, Meta? These companies have JavaScript engineers on payroll making $500,000 a year, but they want individual developers to crowdfund this. And then there's this whole other thread of discussion that's honestly kind of hilarious. Some people are saying, you know what? Maybe Oracle should enforce their trademark.
Maybe they should force everyone to stop using the name JavaScript entirely. The argument goes that JavaScript was always a terrible name anyway. It's constantly confused with Java, which is a completely different language. One user, Bill PG, suggested we could all just rebrand to JS and be done with it. Problem solved. No lawyers needed. But then you've got defenders like user Ilnyar making the case that this really is a genuine public service. They're arguing that Deno's not doing this for themselves. They could easily just avoid using the trademark in their marketing. They're doing it for the thousands of smaller players who can't afford to fight Oracle if they ever decided to enforce this trademark aggressively. Every JavaScript conference, every book title, every job posting that mentions JavaScript, technically they're all at Oracle's mercy right now. The pessimists in the thread, and there are many, keep coming back to one brutal reality. Oracle has essentially unlimited legal resources. Multiple commenters who claim experience with Oracle's legal department describe them as having armies of lawyers who can and will outspend any challenger. One particularly memorable comment described it as trying to fight a forest fire with a garden hose.
What really strikes me about this whole situation is how it crystallizes this bigger problem in tech. How do we get to a place where a company that contributes nothing to a technology can claim ownership over its very name? Oracle doesn't maintain JavaScript, they don't develop it, they don't sit on the standards committee. The language is developed by TC39, implemented by browser vendors, and used by millions of developers. But Oracle holds this trademark like a sword of Damocles over the entire ecosystem. And you know what's wild? Even if Deno raises the money, even if they win this first round, this is just the discovery phase. The actual legal battle could drag on for years and cost millions. Oracle could appeal, countersue, or just drag it out until everyone runs out of money. It's the legal equivalent of a DDoS attack, just overwhelming the other side with process until they give up. But maybe that's exactly why this effort matters. Sometimes you've got to draw a line in the sand even if the odds are stacked against you. And if nothing else, this whole campaign is raising awareness about how ridiculous this situation is. 27,000 developers have already said this is absurd, and that number is growing. Whether this ends with JavaScript being freed, or with everyone just switching to calling it JS, or with Oracle somehow crushing this rebellion, one thing's for sure. It's highlighting just how broken our system is when a company can sit on a trademark for something they didn't create and don't contribute to just because they bought a company that bought another company that... You get the idea. And speaking of control battles in the open source world, we've got another governance crisis that's absolutely rocking one of the most beloved programming communities. All right, we need to talk about what's happening with Ruby Central and RubyGems right now because, wow, this is turning into quite the controversy. The story that's got everyone fired up is titled Ruby Central's Attack on RubyGems, and yes, they're using the word attack deliberately here, which should tell you something about how heated this has gotten. So here's what went down. Ruby Central, which is the nonprofit organization that's been funding and supporting RubyGems for over a decade, suddenly removed several longtime maintainers from the RubyGems and Bundler projects. And when I say suddenly, I mean no warning, no discussion, just boom, access revoked, administrative control seized. The affected maintainers found out when they literally couldn't access the systems anymore. Now, if you're not familiar with RubyGems, it's basically the package repository for the Ruby programming language. Think of it like NPM for JavaScript or PyPy for Python. It's absolutely critical infrastructure for the Ruby ecosystem. Millions of developers depend on it every single day to download and manage their dependencies. So when something like this happens, it's not just internal drama. It affects the entire Ruby community. The community reaction has been, well, let's just say Ruby Central probably didn't expect this level of backlash. With over 600 points and 200 comments on Hacker News, the discussion is overwhelmingly critical of Ruby Central's actions. People are calling it a hostile takeover, a betrayal of open source principles, and honestly, some of the comments I'm seeing are pretty scathing. There's this real sense of shock and disappointment from developers who've been part of the Ruby community for years. What's particularly troubling here is the pattern people are noticing.
Several commenters are drawing parallels to other recent controversies. The whole WordPress and WP Engine situation we've been covering, issues with NPM governance over the years. There's this growing concern that package repositories are becoming these flashpoints for control battles between corporate interests and community maintainers. One commenter put it really well. They said these repositories started as community projects, but as they've become critical infrastructure, we're seeing more attempts to consolidate control. Now, there is one dissenting voice in all this that I think is worth mentioning. A user named K33N argued that calling this an attack is misleading since Ruby Central has been funding RubyGems for over a decade. They're suggesting that maybe one of the removed maintainers is actually trying to burn it all down and questioning how much they actually contributed to the codebase versus just having administrative access. It's definitely a minority opinion in the discussion, but it does raise the question of who really owns these projects when there's both community involvement and organizational funding. The community isn't just complaining, though, they're demanding action. There are calls for Ruby Central to restore access immediately, to implement transparent governance policies, and some are even talking about pressuring Ruby Central sponsors if they don't see changes. It's gotten to the point where people are discussing forking the entire project, though that would be incredibly disruptive given how central RubyGems is to the ecosystem. What really strikes me about this situation is how it highlights the fragility of our modern development infrastructure. We rely so heavily on these package repositories, but the governance structures around them are often, let's say, informal at best. When relationships break down, when trust is violated like this, the entire community suffers. And Ruby Central's complete silence on this, they haven't made a public statement explaining their actions, is just making things worse. You know what's wild? This is happening at a time when Ruby has been having something of a renaissance. Rails 8 just came out, there's renewed interest in the language, and now this governance crisis threatens to overshadow all that positive momentum. It's like the technical side of Ruby is thriving, but the organizational side is imploding, and that disconnect is really concerning for the future of the ecosystem. The bigger picture here, and why this matters beyond just the Ruby community, is that we're seeing these governance crises pop up more and more frequently in open source. As these projects become critical infrastructure for literally millions of applications, the informal, we'll figure it out as we go approach to governance just doesn't work anymore. We need better structures, clearer processes, and most importantly, we need organizations to remember that their legitimacy comes from the community's trust, not from legal ownership of a domain name. Now, switching gears from governance nightmares to hardware nightmares, let's talk about what happens when enthusiasm meets reality in the most expensive way possible. Story 4. Pi Cluster Regret. All right, so our next story is something that's going to resonate with anyone who's ever gone down an expensive tech rabbit hole. Jeff Geerling, who's basically royalty in the Raspberry Pi community, just published a piece titled, "I regret building this $3,000 Pi AI cluster." And wow, the Hacker News crowd had thoughts about this one. Over 400 points and 300 comments worth of thoughts. So here's what happened. Jeff ordered these compute blades back in April 2023, fancy carrier boards designed specifically for clustering Raspberry Pis, and they took 2 full years to arrive. 2 years. By the time they showed up, Raspberry Pi had already moved from the CM4 to the CM5. So right out of the gate, his hardware was outdated. But he pressed on, spent the $3,000, built this 10-node cluster, and then, well, the title kind of gives away how it went. The thing is, Jeff isn't just some random blogger who didn't know what he was doing. This guy literally wrote the book on Ansible for DevOps. He's been building Pi clusters for years, and he's usually the one championing these projects. So when he comes out and says, "I regret this," that's significant. It's like hearing Gordon Ramsay say he regrets opening a restaurant. The problems started immediately. He had to rebuild the entire cluster 3 times. 3 times! Because of failing NVMe drives, thermal throttling that required adding heat sinks, network configuration nightmares. It was just one thing after another. And when he finally got it stable enough to run benchmarks, the numbers were brutal. His $3,000 Pi cluster managed 77 gigaflops. For comparison, he tested an x86 framework desktop cluster that cost $8,000 and got over 1,200 gigaflops. So you're paying almost half the price for like 6% of the performance. That's not just bad, that's why did I do this to myself bad. But here's what really caught my attention. And this challenge is something we've all kind of accepted as gospel in tech circles. The ARM efficiency advantage, it's gone. Jeff found that modern x86 systems are actually more power efficient than these Pi clusters. That's huge. For years, the narrative has been, sure, x86 is faster, but ARM sips power. Not anymore, apparently. The Hacker News discussion on this was fascinating because it wasn't the usual, well, actually, nitpicking you sometimes see. People were basically like, yeah, no kidding. There was this pragmatic, almost weary acceptance that Pi clusters have always been educational toys, rather than serious infrastructure. One commenter put it perfectly. They said if Pi clusters were actually cost competitive for real workloads, Amazon and Google would have data centers full of them, but they don't because, well, they're not. A bunch of folks suggested that if you really want to learn distributed computing, just spin up VMs on a single beefy machine. Someone mentioned you can get a 16-core AMD system that'll run circles around any Pi cluster for learning Kubernetes or whatever distributed system you're interested in. And honestly, they're right. You get better performance, easier management, and you can snapshot and restore your experiments.
There was this interesting undercurrent in the comments, though. Some people suggested Jeff knew this would fail from the start, that he built it for the content, for the YouTube views and blog posts. And you know what? Even if that's true, I respect it. Sometimes you need someone to actually spend the money and time to definitively prove what everyone suspects. It's like, we all knew Pi clusters weren't practical, but now we have data, we have benchmarks, we have a respected community member saying, I tried it, so you don't have to. The only dissenting voice that caught my eye was someone arguing that Pi clusters are still the absolute cheapest way to learn MPI and distributed programming interfaces. They're not wrong if you specifically need to test inter-node communication and can't virtualize for some reason. A Pi cluster might still make sense, but that's such a narrow use case. What really strikes me about this whole story is how it represents this shift in the maker and hobbyist community. For years, Raspberry Pi clusters were this aspirational project. You'd see these beautiful photos of blinking lights and tiny computers all networked together, and it felt like the future. But now, the magic's kind of gone. The Pi 5 costs $80, availability is still spotty, and by the time you add storage and networking and power supplies, you're better off just buying a used Dell server off eBay. Jeff ends his post by explicitly saying he can't recommend Pi clusters for anything beyond learning purposes. Coming from him, that's basically the final nail in the coffin for Pi clusters as anything more than an expensive educational toy. And honestly, maybe that's okay. Not every tech project needs to be practical. Sometimes the journey is the point, even if that journey costs $3,000 and ends in regret. And finally, let's end with something completely different. A story that reminds us that no matter how weird we think our tech problems are, nature is out there breaking rules we didn't even know existed. All right, so you know how we love stories that make us completely rethink what we thought we knew? Our final story today is about ants that seem to defy biology. They lay eggs that hatch into another species. And yes, you heard that right. Another species entirely. This absolutely wild discovery from the Smithsonian has the Hacker News community buzzing with 340 points and over 100 comments. And honestly, I can see why. We're talking about these ants called M. ibericus that have figured out what might be the ultimate biological hack. These queen ants can mate with males from a different species, M. structor. And here's where it gets truly bizarre. They can actually lay eggs that contain only the genetic material from that other species. Zero DNA from the mother. It's like, imagine if a cat could give birth to pure dogs. That's the level of weird we're dealing with here. So here's how this insane process works.
The M. ibericus queens mate with these M. structor males, right? First, they produce hybrid workers. These are sterile, they're basically the workforce of the colony. But then, and this is where it breaks your brain a little, these queens can somehow strip out their own genetic material from certain eggs and produce pure M. structure male clones. The mechanism here is it's mind-blowing. The queen is essentially acting as an incubator for another species' genetics. Now, the Hacker News discussion on this is fascinating because you've got people trying to wrap their heads around why evolution would even allow this. One user, LarsDo88, points out that this seems to violate Hamilton's law, the whole idea that organisms should favor reproduction that spreads their own genes, or at least genes of their relatives. These clones share literally zero DNA with the queen producing them, so why would she do it? The leading theories are either that the genes themselves are acting selfishly, kind of hijacking the queen's reproductive system, or there might even be some parasitic organism involved that we haven't discovered yet. But here's what I love about the discussion. People started sharing all these other completely bonkers reproductive strategies from nature. There's this thing called kleptogenesis in salamanders, where they literally steal genetic material from other species. There's brood parasitism, where birds trick other species into raising their young. And don't even get me started on those zombie fungi that take over ant brains. Nature is just so much more weirder than we give it credit for. One commenter, Jubal, actually pushed back a bit on the whole defying biology framing, and I think they make a good point. They're saying, look, we already know the concept of species is fuzzy. We've got ring species. We've got hybrids that can sometimes reproduce. We've got horizontal gene transfer in bacteria. This discovery is absolutely amazing, but it's not like we need to throw out our biology textbooks. It's more like we're adding another incredible chapter to an already pretty wild book.
What really strikes me about this whole thing is how it shows that even with something as fundamental as reproduction, something every living thing does, nature still has surprises up its sleeve. We think we understand the rules, and then some ant queen in Spain is like, hold my beer, I'm gonna lay eggs that turn into a completely different species. The evolutionary implications here are they're huge. How did this evolve? Is it parasitism? Is it mutualism? Is the M. ibericus queen getting something out of producing these foreign males? The researchers don't have all the answers yet, which honestly makes it even more exciting. And you know what's really cooking people's noodles in the comments? The fact that this challenges our whole concept of what makes something an individual organism versus a colony. These ant colonies are already superorganisms in a way, but now you've got one species literally producing another species as part of its life cycle. It's like, where does one organism end and another begin? The more you dig into this story, the more it feels like we're just scratching the surface of how creative evolution can be. And that's what makes science so incredible, right? Just when you think you've got nature figured out, it throws you a curveball like queens laying eggs that hatch into a different species entirely.